Lecture 5, November 29, 1960. Now I think I should just say a few more words in relation to what we were talking about last time, since it has been almost a fortnight now since our last session. We had pointed out that the concept of being, or our talk of being, for the concept of being is not an entirely accurate way of speaking about what I am trying to express, is intrinsically marked by a most remarkable ambiguity. On the one hand, being is a concept, the broadest concept for everything that can possibly be brought under the highest conceptual unity. That is how we would have to define being if we do indeed wish to treat it as a concept. On the other hand, however, being evokes also something else, namely the aspect which a philosopher such as Heinrich Rickert once described with the expression heterogeneous continuum '1, that moment which is not itself conceptual, which is not exhausted by our subjectively instituted concepts, which for its part underlies all conceptuality. That we are justified in speaking in this way is evident, as I have already indicated, from a certain arbitrary character that clings to every process of concept formation, despite all of the later Plato's efforts to escape this very problem. In other words, the way we cut up our concepts always has something arbitrary about it. Any individual thing can be embraced under countless concepts, and there is no absolutely compelling necessity within the thing which demands that it be grasped under this and only this concept or under these and only these concepts. Again, every concept reveals an enormous degree of vagueness with respect to its possible forms of realization, given that the concept identifies only one feature or only certain features of what it embraces, leaving others free in turn. It is precisely by virtue of this freedom in relation to those dimensions not defined by the concept that so much more already finds its way into the concept, so much which for its part appears contingent or indifferent to the latter. These points may help briefly to remind you that the order which our concepts procure for us, especially in the scientific context, is not immediately identical with the way things are, with the constitution of that to which these concepts are directed. It is for this very reason that the fundamental thesis of Spinoza's metaphysics and theory of knowledge, according to which the order of ideas and the order of things is identical, can rightly be described as the leading principle of rationalist philosophy in general. And the entire critique of Western rationalism, especially as it derives from Kant, has in fact destroyed this conception of knowledge, although the basic question involved goes back much further and is none other than the old problem which was discussed under the name of nominalism in the wake of late medieval philosophy. Now the truth is that, if I may point out the relevant structure, to put this benevolently, or the relevant trick, to put it less benevolently, in fundamental ontology or the philosophy of being, this moment of ambiguity, between being as concept and being as what is beyond the concept, this deficiency or inadequacy which lies in language here and indeed points towards something deeper, is not acknowledged by fundamental ontology or the philosophy of being as a deficiency at all. On the contrary, it is chalked up as a positive and accounted as credit. In the course of our investigations we shall find again and again that, whenever such deficiencies of thought or the concept are encountered by this philosophy, they are exploited in a distinctive way and used to lend a particular dignity to its own claims. Now I am trying in these lectures to immunize you with a certain resistance to these philosophical tendencies that continue to be so influential in Germany. And I believe it is no bad advice if I encourage you, when confronted with the basic theses of fundamental ontology, always to ask whether some moment of insufficiency, of inadequate knowledge or concept formation, or whatever it may be, is not perhaps being used in just this way. In other words, whether a concept's failure to accomplish what it is specifically meant to accomplish serves only to prove and reveal its peculiar profundity or its priority, to use a Heideggerian expression, over against the labor and exertion of the concept, to use a Hegelian expression. But I do not want to make it too easy for us either. Things really stand on a knife edge, as is usually the case where truth is concerned, for truth is something extraordinarily fragile. And, if philosophy can teach you anything, it's that you should perhaps lose a little of your faith that truth clings to the massive differences, that it's something you can just take home in your great big folders and notebooks. 5 But the matter is not that simple. Thus that wavering indifference of the word being which we talked about, the way it is at once concept and non-concept, namely the concept of what cannot for its part become a concept, also announces something of constitutive significance. And I would even go so far as to agree with Heidegger and say that it is not even the least of the criteria of philosophy, or certainly not the most contemptible, that it be able to explore such ambiguous matters which hardly unfold in accordance with any established rules of play. For this ambiguity reveals something which can never be eliminated by deliberate definitional procedures, or could be eliminated only in the most superficial manner for specific organizational purposes. It reveals, on the one hand, to emphasize this once again here, that we can only ever think in conceptual terms, that conceptuality is the prison in which our thought finds itself enclosed, but also, on the other, that what we strive to grasp in thought, what we intend to think, is by no means exhausted in this structure, that the task of thought is to recognize its own limits through self-reflection. In this sense at least, the old Aristotelian demand that thought should think itself remains in force, even if we no longer feel authorized to regard the nu eta sigma iota sigma nu omicron sigma epsilon omega sigma, noesis notio 6 as a positive given or some kind of transcendental fact. But, even if we concede all this, there is still an enormous difference between recognizing the aporetic character of the word being and what this aporetic character shows us, or turning this aporia itself into a prerogative and acting as if the concept of being, as Heidegger once put it in rather questionable German, were the allmählichst, or most unique, concept that we have. And this is the limit that we are concerned with here. Since the word being in itself also marks a limit with respect to the conceptual, since the intention of this word is conceptually directed at what is not exhausted in the concept, it is illegitimate to appeal to this word, given that it is nonetheless still a concept, as if it were somehow immediately beyond the concept at the same time. This is a very fine distinction, I will readily admit, but there is no way around this subtlety, for it actually harbors something quite decisive for our problem. When a concept points towards something that is not for its part conceptual, you may say that conceptuality itself is thereby limited or qualified in some way. Conceptual thought is quite capable of becoming its own warning, its own writing on the wall. Yet it is a delusion to imagine that such self-reflection, in which thought recognizes that it does not exhaust what it thinks, would already imply that thought enjoyed some positive access to what is beyond thinking, merely by belaboring the kind of words that expose this limit. You can understand why this is impossible if you remember, from our last analysis, how we showed that being not only aims conceptually at that non-conceptuality but also is itself a concept. But this strange double meaning that is harbored in the word being is exploited by the Heidegger school as if the distinctive character of the word itself allowed its conceptual dimension to recede behind something quite other than this, precisely because that otherness is what is conceptually meant. Yet, in spite of this intention directed towards the non-conceptual, the word still does not cease to be a concept. In other words, to come back to this point, in the word being we do not immediately have being in our mouths, so to speak. For something is meant by this word, as with every concept, and this limit over against what lies beyond the concept also needs to be respected in our talk of being, although the philosophy of being rides right over it. What the philosophy of being makes out of this non-conceptual moment of the concept of being, out of this conceptual remembrance of the non-conceptual, is deployed by this philosophy in a very particular way. Thus being is supposedly distinguished from two aspects or moments, on the one hand from the abstraction or pure universal concept of being, and on the other from anything determinate included under a general concept, namely from its correlate, or the particular beings from which abstraction is made. The profit, if I may put it this way, that the philosophy of being derives from the wavering character of its most unique concept is precisely the way it allows this philosophy to retain this wavering word on both sides. Thus on the one side, as I have already indicated on various occasions, being is not supposed to coincide with beings, and nor is it supposed to be a summary concept for all particular beings. It is supposed to be something quite other than all this. In the first place we have to say that this otherness of being with respect to beings is nothing but conceptuality itself. In other words, being is distinguished from all particular beings that are included within it in the sense that it is the concept of those beings, rather than being immediately the same as the latter. Now the philosophy of being eagerly cashes in on this conceptuality, even while it insists at the same time that being is not itself a concept. And this gives rise to that curiously indeterminate and wavering structure which, if you will forgive the vulgar expression here, manages to draw the cream off both sides at once, namely from the concept and from particular beings. The cream of the concept consists in the fact that we are talking here not about some arbitrary or contingent particular being but about something which, as they like to say, is prior to that, something that is allegedly higher and more dignified with respect to beings. At the same time the cream of beings is supposed to consist in the fact that what we are talking about here is not something conceptual but something concrete, namely something substantial that already underlies conceptuality in the first place. I believe that this quid pro quo that I have tried to analyze for you is indeed the mechanism through which the dignity of all this talk of being arises. But this process should not be understood, and I hope you grasp the actual methodological point of what I have been saying here, simply in social or psychological genetic terms. For it is something which arises out of the economy of the concepts in question, that is necessitated by the constellation of the relevant elements concept/non-concept and beings. Let me remind you that the two moments from which being, now written by Heidegger as nor even struck through as being 7, is persistently distinguished, namely the concept and the given, are also those moments in being where subjectivity, a thinking subject, is involved as a constitutive factor, in other words, that thinking subject which was not subjected to reflection in the ancient form of ontology, while such reflection cannot be avoided in the context of modern ontology. For the concept is indeed the subjective intellectual contribution, the result of abstraction, and beings, as givenness, at least in the sense of traditional philosophy, are what remains in the hyletic givens, the primary materials of consciousness, which can no longer be eliminated. And to that extent one of the essential features of all ontology, one of the features to which it most emphatically owes its influence, is to be found precisely here, its anti-subjectivism, or the appearance that philosophy had somehow escaped its imprisonment within subjectivity through this ontological project. This apparent overcoming of subjectivism in conditions where nothing has actually changed regarding the presuppositions of subjectivism is intimately bound up with that quid pro quo that I have tried to lay out for you. This apparently higher dignity of ontology as something prior to subjectivity is actually grounded in this, that those deficiencies of reflection regarding what being means are chalked up to the philosophy of being, so that the so-called overcoming of subjectivism, as an essential consequence in my view, which is surely one of the strongest seductions of this philosophy, arises only from that wavering, negative and inarticulate character of this talk of being itself. And just as we should mistrust the word overcoming in general, so too we should certainly mistrust any philosophy which has nothing with which to replace the positivity of its pathos except the ambiguity of the medium within which it moves. In spite of these moments that we have just discussed, it is very characteristic of modern ontology that it stays within the domain of language, as I think I have already pointed out to you. Yet I want to re-emphasize this here, for you may want to object that these rather subtle distinctions, as Kant would call them, in our own fundamental critical investigation of being have basically all been oriented to the meaning of the word being, and that the ultimate intention of fundamental ontology, what it is actually defending, is getting rather short shrift here. Now I think I have in principle already responded to this objection when I pointed out that fundamental ontology too cannot become aware of the other or the beyond of language, of that which is not exhausted in the concept, except by virtue of the concept. In other words, fundamental ontology cannot possibly sustain the claim through which it would counter conceptual thought. But, even if we disregard this here, I believe that fundamental ontology cannot seriously raise any objections to the method which I have employed in these last analyses of ours, since this ontology emphatically presents itself precisely as a philosophy of language. You will recall how I said that the word being is a concept, for when we say the word, irrespective of whether being has a particular range, as other concepts also do, or whether this range is intrinsically problematic, this word being is not immediately being itself. In other words, as I put it somewhat drastically before, we do not thereby already have or feel being in our mouths. For in God's name we actually just have the word itself. Now Heidegger's philosophy is extremely consistent and acute in this regard and never even supposes the absurdity I have just suggested, namely the idea that we ever could have being itself in our mouths. In other words, Heidegger knows perfectly well that I am also compelled by conceptuality itself to call being a concept, and that this moment of mediation has thus already found its way into any attempt to philosophize about being, even though he strives to suspend it for the sake of his own ideal of original thought. And the conclusion he draws from all this is indeed that language must here be immediately one with what language expresses. In his very fine dissertation, Schweppene diaresis user 8 has shown how Heidegger effectively began as a theorist of linguistic meaning in a more or less traditional Husserlian sense, but was subsequently driven to ascribe some kind of immediate and substantial being to language. And this is duly reflected in his famous remarks that being illuminates or unconceals itself within language, and in all those speculations where Comrade Heidegger 9 even found himself remarkably close to certain theses of the Kabbalistic philosophy of language, as it subsequently turns out. After what I have just explained here, you will perhaps understand, and I really want to help you grasp the inner structure, the force field, of this philosophy, precisely why Heidegger arrives at the eccentric claim that being immediately unveils itself in language, rather than simply saying that language expresses being. For, if he is in earnest with this intention, with the claim that being is in principle neither conceptual in character nor indeed a being, even though it is only in language that we have being at all, then this can only be sustained if ontological dignity is already bestowed on language itself. In other words, language must be approached as if it were the manifestation of what is meant in it, as if language immediately coincided with the latter, rather than standing in various intentional relations of tension towards that which it expresses. Here too I am following my methodological principle that does not allow me to eliminate or simply cavil about the difficulties involved in particular philosophies, and I regard both such approaches as equally unworthy. For the task is to develop these philosophies out of the urgency and aporia of the thinking in question, out of the difficulties in which it finds itself entangled, in short, out of its own internal dynamic. And this is what we have found with Heidegger. Let me just add that the kind of philosophy of language we encounter here is at home in the theological domain and is one that becomes intelligible, assumes a meaningful context, inasmuch as it proceeds from the idea of a true language, that of the revelation of the divine word, a language which corresponds, as it were, to the intellectus archetypus 10 in which thought and intuition actually coincide with each other. The whole problem of this philosophy of language in Heidegger seems to me to be the way that it is borrowed from theology while nonetheless being detached from this theological ground, so that this approach is now just freely ascribed to language as such, completely ignoring the historicity of language and the particular historical features of language, without showing in any convincing way where the dignity thus afforded to language comes from. This is all only done for the sake of a rhyme 11, in other words, in order to fulfill the function which the exemplary word being is called upon to fulfill in this philosophy. But this doctrine of language thereby assumes a merely mythological character. In other words, language is simply and magically furnished once again with all those qualities which were once criticized as problematic by nominalist reflection, or at least as something that did not necessarily have to attach to language. I would just like to draw two very brief conclusions from what I have said in this attempted deduction, this critical deduction of the philosophy of language that is bound up with fundamental ontology. The first thing, given precisely what I have said about the burden of language, indeed the inevitable burden of language, is that one cannot object to the specific arguments or reflections that I have presented here simply by claiming that they are concerned with semantic problems, namely the problem of the meaning of being, rather than immediately with being itself. I have already tried to show you that this objection is beside the point, since we do not encounter being directly or immediately, we encounter it only in the form of language. After what I have tried to explicate for you here, all I have to add is that, even if language is indeed the medium, the organon, the complexus of truth, rather than simply a body of signs, just as Heideggerian philosophy claims, then it is only right and proper for philosophy, and especially critical philosophy, to engage with such thinking specifically in terms of the philosophy of language. It is right and proper for us, in other words, to explore the kind of language where that which is highest of all, the summum bonum, namely being, claims to dwell. One cannot on the one hand set language and the philosophy of language in the place of theory of knowledge, or even of metaphysics, while objecting on the other hand when we actually proceed to analyze the language in question, as if to say, well, you are just doing philosophy of language here, whereas what we are ultimately concerned with is not language but being. This is a trick, a quid pro quo, and I want to tear this veil open, and I hope you will follow me in the procedure I have undertaken here and avoid participating in this kind of shadow boxing. The second thing which follows from our reflections, and this is a moment that I would like to pursue further in this lecture if time permits, although I already offer it here as a programmatic hint at least for engaging with this philosophy, is this: if any philosophy of language betrays the kind of pathos we have just been talking about, then it surely implies an incomparable obligation with regard to the language involved here. If language claims to be more than simply a matter of signs, if it takes itself to stand in an absolutely essential relationship to the real question, and in a certain sense I would indeed agree with Heidegger regarding our responsibility for finding the appropriate form of language for what is at stake, then it follows that the specific linguistic articulation we adopt must answer to the greatest rigor, the greatest exactitude, and the greatest sense of responsibility we can summon. Now if a detailed analysis of language, which I probably cannot deliver in these lectures, but which I can promise you in some form or other for the future 12, could demonstrate that the language which appears in this philosophy cannot, and immanently by virtue of its own form, do justice to the claim such language announces as the content of philosophy, this would be a fatal objection to a philosophy which can ultimately be critically addressed only in terms of its language precisely because it has cast the entire burden of its truth upon language. Now if I have taken advantage of various occasions, as some of you may know, to speak of the jargon of authenticity in critical connection with the entire structure of this philosophy, 13 and have repeatedly analyzed certain figures of language encountered in this field, this was certainly not for the sake of deriving merely literary pleasure from a polemic against a philosophy which acts as if it drew its inspiration from the Castalian Spring 14 while talking the most professorial German. That might well be an enjoyable pastime, but it would hold very little interest for me. For these excursions into the analysis of language which I repeatedly allow myself, and with regard to which I hope to undertake a thorough expedition into the jungle one day, touch the nerve of the whole. In other words, they touch the point where the whole of fundamental ontology is secured, as Kant would say, 15 where its own truth claim is to found, and where at the same time its own solidity and substantial character can be discerned. Let me just say a few words here which we may be able to consider more closely in the context of our preliminary discussion of the relation between being and beings. We shall need to address this much more carefully in its own right later on in the lectures. It belongs to the curious wavering character of being, which I discussed with you in terms of conceptuality as a model, that this same implicit and wavering character is also assumed in relation to the domain of beings, as I have already suggested. On the one side, being is meant to be prior to beings, to be that original dimension in whose pathos the old Platonic and Aristotelian notions of true and enduring being, in contrast with ephemeral and illusory being, still survive. On the other side, however, being, and once again this recalls being as concept, as the comprehensive concept of everything it encompasses, is also the totality of beings as such. In this conceptual sense, being would just be all beings. And this second wavering effect, this interference, if I can describe it that way, in the word being also arises from the history of philosophy. In Plato it is implicit in the way that true being essentially consists in the ideas, while the merely scattered and particular beings are supposed to be tau mu nu, to meon, non-being, or that which is utterly nugatory and delusory. But, then again, philosophy is also compelled to take up this mu nu, meon, to describe it as space, or indeed finally to grasp the ideas as the highest possible universals for the individual things which they encompass. And even earlier than this we recognize the same ambiguity in the concept of being in the structure of the great didactic poem of Parmenides, which remains of course an extremely enigmatic and, in many ways, contentious text. The first part of the poem declares the concept of being in the emphatic purity that Heidegger basically endorses and ascribes to Parmenides. Now although whole libraries have been written about the connection between the two parts, and I hesitate to express an opinion of any kind here, since it would almost certainly be challenged by the classical philologists in one way or another, the second part of the poem specifically addresses that realm of delta xi alpha, doxa, or opinion, the realm of particular, scattered and merely apparent beings that was so conspicuously excised from the first part. If we really wish to take Parmenides seriously, we can recognize here the need to give expression to that double character of being within philosophy itself. In other words, on the one hand being as that which is not concept, and on the other hand being as the concept par excellence, as the concept of all beings. And the same problem returns in a certain way in Aristotle, as I shall discuss next time, when we shall also say more about the problem of tau nu, ta'on, and tau nu tau alpha, ta anta. Lecture 6.